Welcome to Thinking Bedtime, where philosophy and psychology are told slowly and gently. Each video offers a thoughtful perspective, helping to illuminate philosophical and psychological ideas from cultures around the world. Thank you for listening. If you find value here, please like, share, and subscribe so Thinking Bedtime can continue to accompany you each night. Today, Thinking Bedtime respectfully presents to you the complete content on the philosophy of sex and sexuality. Part 1. Overview and Basic Concepts. Section 1. Definition of the philosophy of sexuality. The philosophy of sexuality studies sexuality not as inherently good or bad, but as a field shaped by ethical, metaphysical, and conceptual considerations. It examines sexual desire as a biological capacity for attraction and pleasure, intertwined with ethical issues surrounding consent, objectification, and purpose. Sexuality has been given little attention in the history of Western philosophy, and what it has received has not been very favorable. Plato downplayed it, believing it should lead to something nobler or better. Aristotle hardly mentioned it, and Christian philosophers condemned it. Augustine argued that its pleasures are dangerous because they dominate us and only allowed sexuality for reproduction, while Aquinas limited its permissibility to marital acts and reproduction. Immanuel Kant considered it the only inclination that cannot satisfy the categorical imperative, and Jean-Paul Sartre declared that sexual desire aims to seize the freedom of others. The Marquis de Sade went to the opposite extreme, praising all kinds of sexual behavior, including rape. Only in modern times did philosophers, starting with Bertrand Russell and including Sigmund Freud, view sexuality in general as good. Among the many topics explored by philosophy regarding sexuality, we can mention reproduction, contraception, celibacy, marriage, infidelity, promiscuity, courtship, prostitution, homosexuality, masturbation, seduction, rape, sexual harassment, BDSM, pornography, bestiality, and pedophilia. What do all these have in common? They are all related in various ways to the broad field of human sexuality. That is, on one hand, they relate to human desires and activities involving seeking and achieving pleasure or sexual satisfaction. On the other hand, they relate to human desires and activities involving the creation of new human beings. Because it is a natural characteristic of humans that certain behaviors and body parts can be used for pleasure or reproduction or both. The philosophy of sexuality explores these topics both conceptually and normatively. Concept analysis in the philosophy of sexuality aims to clarify the fundamental concepts of desire and sexual activity. Concept analysis is also undertaken in efforts to provide satisfactory definitions of adultery, prostitution, rape, pornography, etc. E.g., what specific features of a desire make it a sexual desire rather than something else? How does seduction differ from non-violent rape? Is often challenging and appears strict, but it yields surprising and remarkable rewards. Normative philosophy of sexuality studies the value of sexual activity and sexual pleasure as well as their various forms. Therefore, the philosophy of sexuality is concerned with timeless questions about sexual ethics and constitutes a major branch of applied ethics. Normative philosophy of sexuality investigates what sexuality contributes to a good life or virtue and seeks to determine which moral obligations prevent us from engaging in certain sexual behaviors and which moral permissions allow us to participate in other behaviors. Section 2. The nature of sexual desire. The concept of sexual desire is a central concept in the philosophy of sexuality, related to other core concepts, especially sexual attraction, sexual pleasure, sexual motivation, arousal, and sexual activity, all of which are discussed below.
It refers to the biological capacity of humans to be attracted to others and seek pleasure and sexual activity, and it also pertains to specific cases of desiring particular people or activities, e.g., when X has sexual desire for Y. The 5 main issues related to sexual desire are: 1. Whether it is simply a biological instinct, a deliberate mental state, or both. 2. How it should be defined, whether it is benign or malignant. 3. Whether acting on it should be morally restricted in specific contexts. And 5. Whether it can take deviant forms. Definitions of sexual desire based on sexual pleasure seem to understand sexual desire fundamentally as a craving. According to such a definition, sexual desire is the desire to contact another person's body and the pleasure that such contact brings. Goldman, or sexual desire, is the desire for certain physical pleasures. Premaratz. Thus, if X feels sexual desire, then X wishes to touch the body of another person, Y, and derives sexual pleasure from that contact. Another definition avoids the conceptual involvements of others, instead understanding sexual desire as a desire for sexual pleasure in general. This includes cases where the desire does not involve touching another person's body. Some cases of masturbation, voyeurism, and exhibitionism, for example.
These viewpoints all share the common idea that sexual desire is a desire for crude physical pleasures, which may imply that sexual desire is merely a biological need. If so, they must face the rebuttal that they have misrepresented the nature of sexual desire, which should be understood as entirely intentional. Morgan. That is, whenever X has a sexual desire for someone or something, X does so under a description. X desires Y because something about Y attracts X. Even when X has a sexual desire for a stranger, X still desires the pleasure of sex with a stranger. From an intentional perspective, sexual desire is not just a need, but also imbued with meaning. Although intentional perspectives do not necessarily emphasize the conceptual requirement of another person, the most common manifestation of it is the idea that sexual desire is interpersonally oriented, that an individual's sexual desire always seeks satisfaction with others, or at least should always seek satisfaction with others. Interpersonal sexual desire involves mobilizing and directing animal instincts toward an interpersonally oriented goal and interpersonally oriented satisfaction, according to Scruton, and can be considered related to multiple levels of cognition. X desires Y. Y desires X, the desire to be stimulated by Y's desire for X, etc., according to Nagel. Some people believe that, in addition, it should focus on love. Scruton, C.F. Giles. The normative view that sexual desire should be interpersonal or interpersonally oriented in a specific way can be rejected as an explanation of the nature of sexual desire. To be considered an explanation of sexual desire, an explanation based on the interaction between individuals must demonstrate a neutral normative perspective among individuals.
However, the perspective on pleasure and sexual desire does not necessarily view sexual desire as merely a craving. For example, if X wants to masturbate, X is not driven by blind instinct. X might be thinking, I want to enjoy the sensation of rubbing my clitoris with my favorite vibrator while imagining having sex with the neighbor. In other words, sexual desire can be focused or selective while still being physical, according to Goldman and Halwani. The perspective on intention seems reasonable because sexual desire can be quite complex, and this complexity is not well captured, or not at all, by the perspective on pleasure, as human psychology influences our most basic urges and desires. But that depends on what we want the perspective on pleasure to achieve. If its goal is to grasp the essence of sexual desire, then these two perspectives are compatible. If it aims to describe in detail the depth, complexity, and diversity of this phenomenon, then the perspective on pleasure falls short.
Since definitions are often not intended to convey the complexity of what they define, we should not expect a definition of sexual desire to be a complete theory of it, and we can agree that sexual desire is a complex phenomenon. This does not mean that the view of pleasure in sexual desire is correct, but rather that its purpose or strategy is not necessarily wrong. Indeed, depending on how it is expressed, the view of pleasure can be mistaken. For example, if it conceptually links sexual desire with the pleasure achieved through touching by others, then sexual desire must be inherently interpersonal and can irrationally render many sexual desires non-sexual, such as certain masturbation, voyeurism, and exhibitionism. Furthermore, touching another person's body implies that the desire for sexual pleasure is non-sexual. Desire for the dead body would also be non-sexual if the person here refers to a living individual. An interpretation in the non-interpersonal sense, excluding all sexual pleasures, avoids such implications. Sobel.
Even the perspective on non-interpersonal pleasure can face difficulties when understanding desire based on what it seeks, sexual pleasure. Calling the approach of defining sexual desire based on what it seeks a target-based strategy, Rockne Jacobson highlights the challenges associated with it. First is the definition of sexual pleasure, which the target-based strategy needs to clarify. Second, Jacobson rejects the idea that all sexual desire is aimed at sexual pleasure, providing an example of a married couple having sex to conceive a child rather than to satisfy pleasure. Third, in principle, our sexual partners will not be necessary if there are other ways to achieve pleasure. This third objection is not about morality, claiming that we use our partners merely as tools, but about ontology. Sexual pleasure cannot be the sole or universal goal of all sexual desires, or else the subject would be indifferent among the various ways of achieving sexual pleasure. Because this is not the case, Jacobson concludes that sexual desire is not solely aimed at satisfying sexual pleasure. Jacobson prefers the feature-based approach, defining sexual desire in terms of sexual arousal, which is the state of excitement that we often experience, manifested through erection, vaginal lubrication, a flushed face, and a tingling sensation in the earlobes. Jacobson, Confer Schaefer. Therefore, when X has a sexual desire for something, another person, an object, or an activity, X desires it because it has a characteristic that X expects will influence X's sexual arousal. The feature-based strategy is considered superior to the object-based strategy because it does not encounter the three difficulties mentioned above.
However, the perspective based on characteristics can avoid responsibility. Either sexual arousal means what we usually understand as sexual desire, examples of sexual arousal, erection, vaginal lubrication can also be used as examples of sexual desire, or it does not. If it is the first case, we still need a definition of sexual arousal, just as we need a definition of sexual desire. If it is the second case, we need an explanation of sexual arousal, because if it is not the same as sexual desire, then what exactly is it? Referring to erection and vaginal lubrication again will not be effective, because we can ask, why aren't they states of sexual desire? Therefore, defining sexual desire based on sexual arousal can only be convincing if we can understand sexual arousal independently of sexual desire. Helwani.
Jacobson's example of a couple engaging in sexual intercourse for reproduction deserves discussion. Jacobson means to say that it is a case of sexual desire not aimed at seeking sexual pleasure. However, this example is not fully described because that desire could be understood as non-sexual reproductive desire. To better address such cases, it is necessary to distinguish between sexual motives, motives involving participation in an activity to experience sexual pleasure, and non-sexual motives, such as having children, making someone jealous, seeking revenge, or passing the time. It can be argued that if the couple in question truly experiences sexual desire for the behavior or for each other, then their non-sexual reproductive motives do not replace the sexual motive, but can be added to it. Although people may engage in sexual activity for entirely non-sexual reasons, in many cases of prostitution, once we assume the presence of sexual desire, the motive to seek sexual pleasure will emerge. The motive for sexual activity, like the motive for non-sexual activities, can be a mixture, including both sexual and non-sexual motives.
One reason for emphasizing the sexual drive in understanding sexual desire is that if sexual desire is partly a biological or physiological state, even though in humans it is also a mental, intentional state, it still has an attraction even in the presence of non-sexual motives. Dent, Hamilton, Wetter. Another reason is that without the motive to seek sexual pleasure, the concept of sexual desire becomes too broad, encompassing any desire for sexual activity, which risks misunderstanding. We might interpret a prostitute's desire for a client as sexual desire, when in fact it is entirely for financial gain. The allure of sexual desire reinforces a pessimistic view of sexuality. Although both pessimism and optimism carry moral implications, some of which will be discussed below, they are based on how pessimists and optimists perceive the nature of sexual desire. Pessimists regard sexual desire as morally dangerous and a threat to our rationality, including Christian philosophers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, Plato, Kant, and Schopenhauer, as well as contemporary philosophers of sexuality such as Alan Sobel, who in his work The Use of Sexuality implies with a certain certainty that he is also a pessimist. The optimistic view holds that sexual desire is generally harmless and has a bonding effect on people. This view is held by most philosophers of sexuality, including Bertrand Russell, Irving Singer, and Martha Nussbaum, although it also acknowledges that sexual desire can cause moral issues. Morgan. The debate between the pessimistic and optimistic perspectives is not about whether sexual desire can cause moral problems, but whether its nature is such that it does. Sobel.
A pessimistic view of sexuality can be very profound. Jean-Paul Sartre's perspective is that sexual desire aims to possess another person entirely through their body. To achieve this, the person performing the act must also transform themselves into pure flesh by allowing sexual desire to block their consciousness. Therefore, I turn myself into flesh before the presence of the other, to seize the flesh of the other, according to Sartre. Another version of this deep pessimism comes from Kant, who believes that sexual desire is directed toward the genitalia or the body of another person rather than their work and service. Sexual desire dismisses the humanity of others and targets the flesh. This does not mean that when craving Y, X will be happy with Y's corpse or with Y unconscious, as well as with Y alive, as Schrage and Stewart assert. For X, Y's death is not equally preferred compared to Y being alive. It also does not mean that during sexual intercourse, X regards Y as an object without desires or personal preferences. Instead, X considers those preferences merely as tools to satisfy X's sexual desires, Hawani and Sobel. The phenomenology of sexual desire seems to support these views, in which when craving Y sexually, X is attracted to Y's physical attributes and body.
Optimists about sexuality believe that although sexual desire can be morally dangerous, it does not necessarily have to be so, and often isn't. They agree that it focuses on the body, but do not see this as an issue. Sex brings intimacy and pleasure, connecting two or more people together. It is a beautiful force, establishing trust and strengthening human relationships. Unlike desire, sexual interest is a sensitivity between individuals, a sensitivity that allows us to enjoy the minds and personalities of others as well as their bodies. Sex can be seen as an instinctive agent through which humans respond to each other through their bodies, according to Singer, Goldman, and Russell. From an optimistic perspective, Sobel notes that sexual pleasure is an end in itself, something valuable and worth promoting because it has intrinsic value, not merely instrumental value.
Sobel and Halwani.
Thomas Nagel rejects Aquinas' central premise that, to discover what is natural in human sexuality, we should emphasize the similarities between humans and lower animals. Applying this formula, Aquinas concludes that the purpose of sexual activity and reproductive organs in humans is reproduction, just as in lower animals. Everything else in Aquinas' philosophy of sexuality is logically derived from this. Conversely, Nagel argues that to discover what is special about human natural sexuality, and thus to determine what is unnatural or deviant, we should focus on the differences between humans and lower animals. We should emphasize the ways in which humans differ from animals, the ways in which humans and their sexuality are unique. Therefore, Nagel argues that sexual deviance in humans should be understood as a psychological phenomenon rather than, as in Aquinas' approach, in terms of anatomy and physiology. Because it is the human psyche that makes us different from other animals, a theory of human natural sexuality must acknowledge the uniqueness of the human mind.
Nagel argues that sexual interactions in which each person responds with sexual arousal upon perceiving the other's arousal reflect the natural psychology of human sexuality. In such encounters, each individual perceives themselves and the other as both the subject and the object of a shared sexual experience. Deviant encounters or events are those in which this mutual recognition of arousal does not exist, and in which one person remains entirely the subject of the sexual experience or entirely the object. Deviance, therefore, is a distortion or truncation of a model of arousal and a psychologically complete consciousness. There is nothing in Nagel's psychological analysis of the natural and the deviant that refers to organs in the body or physiological processes. That is, for a sexual encounter to be natural, it does not need to have a reproductive form, as long as there is the necessary psychological presence of mutual awareness. According to Nagel, whether a sexual activity is natural or deviant does not depend on which parts are used or where they are placed, but solely on the psychological nature of that sexual encounter. Therefore, Nagel does not agree with Aquinas that homosexual activities as a specific type of sexual behavior are unnatural or deviant because oral sex and anal sex between gay individuals can entirely be accompanied by mutual recognition and response to sexual arousal.
Sexual activity. It is difficult to define sexual behavior or sexual activity. Many proposed criteria face challenges. Sobel. This is especially true when related concepts, such as sexual intercourse, do not have the same scope. In everyday language use, and according to some studies, people distinguish between sexual intercourse and sexual activity. They consider many activities to be sexual but not necessarily intercourse, such as masturbation alone, online sex, and even oral sex. Masturbation alone is considered a sexual activity and a sexual behavior, but not intercourse. Although Sobel has recently argued that masturbation alone lies on a continuous spectrum with other forms of sexual activity, both physically and psychologically.
There are a few criteria to define sexual activity. One criterion is reproduction. For an activity to be considered sexual, it must have a reproductive purpose or be aimed at reproduction. This encounters clear counterexamples, such as same-sex sexual activities and oral and anal sex between men and women. Another criterion is physical contact. Sexual activities are those involving contact with the genital organs, although we need to understand what these organs are. This does not meet both the sufficient condition, doctors sometimes need to touch patients' genital organs, and the necessary condition, achieving orgasm during phone sex. Sexual pleasure is the third criterion. Activities are sexual activities that produce sexual pleasure, gray. However, creating sexual pleasure is not a necessary condition because many behaviors do not produce such pleasure, and this criterion conceptually excludes sexuality that does not bring pleasure, Slowell. It may also be insufficient. A man might see someone on the street and feel a slight sexual pleasure, Sobel. The presence of sexual pleasure in this case is not enough for the man's experience to be considered a sexual activity. Perhaps if the man continues to look, then the experience becomes the sexual activity because of his intention to keep looking.
Another criterion is intention, although we need to understand what that intention aims to achieve. A reasonable candidate is the intention to generate sexual pleasure for oneself or for others. However, this is not necessary. Two people engaging in sexual activity for reproduction are performing a sexual act. Experiencing sexual pleasure, if it occurs, is a byproduct of that act. Sobel. This criterion is also insufficient. Suppose X intends to create sexual pleasure for Y by whistling the song Dixie, but what X does is not a sexual act. Another criterion for defining sexual activity is sexual desire. Sexual desire is the desire to be in contact with another person's body and the pleasure that such contact brings. Sexual activity is the activity aimed at satisfying that desire of the individual. Sexual behavior, or activity, as Golden uses the term, is an activity that tends to satisfy sexual desire.
The definition sounds correct. What is sexual behavior if not behavior that satisfies or has a tendency to satisfy sexual desire? But it encounters counterexamples. Consider a prostitute engaging in oral sex with a man. While this behavior satisfies or tends to satisfy the man's sexual desire, it does not satisfy or tend to satisfy the prostitute's sexual desire if she has no desire for the client, which often happens. Therefore, satisfying sexual desire is not a necessary condition for an activity to be considered sexual. Whether it is sufficient or not depends on our understanding of what satisfaction or fulfillment means. If it means desire is no longer felt at the present moment or desire has disappeared, then satisfying sexual desire is not enough. Taking a cold shower, taking strong sleeping pills, or even focusing on another activity can eliminate sexual desire. But these activities are not considered sexual. If satisfying sexual desire means desire achieving its goal, which is sexual gratification, then satisfying sexual desire through a specific activity would be enough for that activity to be considered sexual. But this definition becomes circular. Thus, the criterion of sexual desire alone is insufficient to define sexual behavior.
Based on the above criteria, defining sexual activity is very difficult. An important reason may be that what we usually consider as sexual behavior does not rely on a single criterion. Behavior, intention, contact with specific body parts, etc., all depend on the context. This reason promotes a separative definition according to which an activity is considered sexual if and only if it is performed with a sexual motive, tends to satisfy sexual desire, involves contact with the genitals or body parts of a sexual nature, or one or more parties involved in the activity, or is behaviorally consistent with typical cases of sexual activity. This is just an example of a separative definition. Whether such a definition is successful or not depends on many factors, such as each separative clause itself not having philosophical issues, the list of separative clauses being comprehensive, and the definition not being so cumbersome as to be unfeasible or unhelpful. Another reason why it is difficult to find a clear definition of sexual activity, and which may contradict the separative definition, is that there are many closely related concepts that often have different meanings. Having sex or engaging in sexual activity almost always refer to sexual activity involving at least one other person, while participating in a sexual act or having a sexual experience do not carry this implication, and they are not common expressions.
Therefore, defining these concepts is very challenging if we want the definitions to align with everyday language usage, or if we rely on that usage to construct these definitions. More concerningly, if we need to define these concepts to address practical, ethical, and legal issues, the differences between them and everyday language should make us think carefully. A different approach to ethics from Aquinas is noted by Christine Gudorf, a Christian theologian who shares many similarities with Aquinas. Gudorf agrees that studying human anatomy and physiology provides deep insights into God's plan and design, and that human sexual behavior should align with God's creative intent. That is, Gudorf's philosophy falls within the natural law tradition of Thomas Aquinas.
However, Gudorf argues that if we carefully examine the anatomy and physiology of female reproductive organs, especially the clitoris, rather than focusing solely on the male penis, as Aquinas did, entirely different conclusions about God's plan and design will emerge, and therefore Christian sexual morality becomes less restrictive.
Specifically, Guderstoff asserts that the female clitoris is an organ with the sole purpose of producing sexual pleasure, and unlike the mixed or dual function of the penis, is not related to reproduction. Guderstoff concludes that the existence of the clitoris in the female body indicates that God intended that the purpose of sexual activity is not only reproduction, but also to satisfy sexual pleasure for its own sake. Therefore, according to Guderstoff, sexual activity that provides pleasure without the aim of reproduction does not violate God's intention, is not contrary to nature, and is therefore not necessarily morally wrong, as long as it occurs within the context of a monogamous marriage. Today, we are no longer as confident as Aquinas that God's plan can be discovered by directly examining the bodies of humans and animals, but such healthy skepticism about the ability to distinguish God's intentions from natural world events also seems to apply to Guderstoff's proposal.
Part 2. Superhuman Psychological Schools of Sexuality. 1. Metaphysical sexual pessimism. An extended version of metaphysical pessimism could present the following arguments. Due to the nature of sexual desire, a person with sexual desire for another will turn that person into an object, both before and during sexual activity. Kant said that sexuality turns the loved one into an object of desire. In itself, it is a degradation of human nature. Some forms of manipulation and deception seem necessary before engaging in sexual relations with others, or are so common that they appear to be part of the very essence of the sexual experience. As Bernard Baumann pointed out, sexual interaction is inherently manipulative, physically, psychologically, emotionally, and even intellectually. For example, we try our best to make ourselves appear more attractive and desirable in the eyes of others than we actually are, and we go to great lengths to hide our flaws. And when a person has a sexual desire for someone else, that person's body, lips, thighs, toes, and buttocks are desired as erotic parts, separate from the person themselves. The other person's genitals are also an object of our attention. Sexuality is not a tendency that a person has towards others in general, but a tendency towards the gender of others. Only that person's gender is the object of that person's desire, according to Kant.
Moreover, sexual behavior itself is very special, with uncontrollable arousal, involuntary twitching movements, and a desire to dominate and possess the other person's body. During the act, a person both loses control of themselves and loses respect for the humanity of others. Our sexuality poses a threat to the character of others, but those driven by lust are also on the verge of losing their own humanity. Desire depends on the whims of others to achieve satisfaction, and as a result becomes like a jellyfish, easily influenced and manipulated by others. In desire, you are harmed in the eyes of the object of desire because you've shown that you have intentions that are vulnerable to their intentions. Roger Scruton. Someone making an irresistible sexual proposal to another may be exploiting someone who has become weak due to sexual desire. Furthermore, anyone who indulges in the sexual desires of others automatically becomes a tool. For the natural use of the sexual organs of that gender is for pleasure, and because of that, people dedicate themselves to that gender. In this act, humans transform themselves into objects, which is contrary to their human rights, according to Kant. Those who voluntarily participate in sexual activities and become objects for each other solely for pleasure are both degraded to the level of animals. If a man wishes to satisfy his desires and a woman wishes to satisfy hers, they stimulate each other's desires. Their tendencies meet, but their object is not human nature, but sexuality, and each of them dishonors the human nature of the other. They turn humanity into a tool to satisfy their desires and tendencies, and shame it by equating it with animal nature.
Finally,
Due to the persistent nature of sexual desire, once things start, it is very difficult to stop, and as a result, we often do things related to sex that we never intended or wanted to do. Sexual desire is also extremely difficult to change, being one of the most challenging passions to rationalize, driving us to seek satisfaction even when it involves sneaky touches in alleyways, dirty acts on a microbiological level, secretive activities around the White House, or impulsively getting married. With such a pessimistic metaphysics regarding human sexuality, one can entirely conclude that acting on sexual instincts is always morally wrong. This, in fact, can be correctly regarded as the correct conclusion to draw, even if it implies the destruction of humanity. This apocalyptic outcome is also implied by St. Paul's praise in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 for abstinence as the ideal mental state. However, more often, pessimistic metaphysicians about sexuality conclude that sexual activity is only morally permissible within marriage, lifelong, monogamous, heterosexual marriage, and solely for the purpose of procreation. For physical activities that both lead to reproduction and generate sexual pleasure, it is the reproductive potential that is most important and gives value to these activities. Seeking pleasure is an obstacle to moral sexuality and should not be done intentionally or for its own sake. Sexual pleasure is at most just a tool, used to encourage us to engage in an act whose main purpose is reproduction. Such views are quite common in Christian thought. For example, St. Augustine. A person can turn evil lust into something good and not be controlled by it when they restrain and guard against its fury, and never indulge it unless there is an intention to have children, and then control and direct it towards bodily reproduction, rather than the spiritual dependence on the flesh in a filthy slavery.
2. Metaphysical sexual optimism. Optimists about sexuality from a metaphysical perspective believe that sexuality is a natural and joyful bonding mechanism, connecting people both sexually and non-sexually. Sexual activity includes satisfying oneself and others simultaneously, and these exchanges of pleasure generate both gratitude and affection, thereby deepening human relationships and making them more emotionally resilient. Moreover, and this is the most important point, for the metaphysical optimist, sexual pleasure is an end in itself, something to be valued and promoted because it has intrinsic worth, not just instrumental value. Therefore, the pursuit of sexual pleasure does not require complicated justification. Sexual activity certainly does not need to be limited to marriage or aimed at procreation. A good and virtuous life, while including many other aspects, can also encompass various types and ranges of sexual relationships. Irving Singer is a contemporary philosopher of sexuality who clearly expressed a metaphysical optimism. Although sexual interest is similar to a desire in some respects, it differs from hunger or thirst in that it is a sensitivity between individuals, a sensitivity that allows us to enjoy the minds and personalities of others as well as their bodies. Although sometimes people can be used as sexual objects and abandoned once their utility has been exhausted, this is not the definition of sexual desire. By awakening us to recognize the lively presence of others, sexuality can allow us to treat that person as the human being they inherently are. Nothing in the nature of sexuality itself necessarily turns people into objects. On the contrary, sexuality can be seen as an instinctual agent through which people respond to each other through their bodies.
Pausanias, in Plato's dialogue, asserts that sexuality itself is neither good nor bad. Therefore, he recognizes that there can be morally bad sexual activity and morally good sexual activity, and he proposes a corresponding distinction between what he calls vulgar love and heavenly love. A person with vulgar love is someone who experiences promiscuous sexual desire, with lust that can be satisfied by any partner, and only seeks sexual pleasure for themselves. Conversely, a person with heavenly love experiences a desire for sexual attachment to a specific individual. They care about the other's character and happiness, as well as about physical contact and sexual satisfaction through that person. C.S. Lewis described a similar distinction between sexuality itself and desire in his book The Four Loves. And perhaps that is what Alan Bloom meant when he wrote, "Animals have sexuality, and humans have desire, and no exact science or philosophy can exist without making such a distinction." The difference between metaphysical optimists and metaphysical pessimists can be expressed as follows. Pessimists believe that sexuality, unless strictly constrained by internalized social norms, tends to be driven by trivial desires, while optimists believe that sexuality itself does not lead to or become trivial, but rather its nature is easy and often sacred. What is the value of sexuality? How important or valuable is this value? Reproduction, love, and pleasure are obvious answers to the first question. Sex is often a means of reproduction, so sex has value when reproduction is valuable. But this value is instrumental and depends on the technology's ability to separate reproduction from sex. There are also anti-reproductive philosophies, Schopenhauer and Benatar, implying that sex has a negative value in terms of reproduction. Therefore, the value of sex related to reproduction is uncertain.
Another instrumental value of sexuality is that X's sexual desire for Y can help cause X to love Y, Bertocci. Here, the value of sexuality depends on love, and although it may sound strange, the value of romantic love, especially in the passionate early stages, is unclear due to its negative effects on the lover and others. However, if sexuality leads to a stable phase of love through the passionate stage, then it has value because of that. Sexuality can also express love and affection for one's partner and strengthen their relationship. Natasha McKeever argues that many benefits of sexuality, pleasure, bonding, intimacy, and care, are shared with the benefits of love, so sexual interactions enhance and reinforce love. Even if this is true, all of these still make the value of sexuality dependent on and instrumental to love, especially since the two are very different according to Goldman and Van Noy. Does sexuality have intrinsic value? If so, it is probably sexual pleasure, in the form of sensation or enjoyment, a pleasure that provides humans with an important motivation for sexual activity, often leading to serious consequences. So, what is the value of sexual pleasure? Perhaps we should consider our sexual desire similar to our desire for food to avoid obsessing over it, Russell. But can we go even further?
People spend a lot of time pursuing projects and activities they love or consider worthwhile. Some only do so in free time, work, or family commitments allow, while others do so most of the time. For example, they are independently wealthy. Writing, pursuing fame in Hollywood or Bollywood, playing chess, swimming, traveling, and of course, building a family are examples. Except for distant philosophical examples of pointless pursuits, counting blades of grass, collecting bottle caps, most projects and activities have some value, unless we are willing to condemn most people as having worthless lives. Perhaps some projects are more valuable than others, although arguing this is very difficult, but most have value, and that value is intellectual, including what many might consider mentally passive, such as watching reality TV or reading trash novels. Carol. Now consider X, a person whose life goal is to pursue sexual pleasure. X says, "I'm young, fairly attractive, and with current technology, I can easily find sexual partners. I enjoy sex, and it makes me feel good. Between sexual encounters, I can meet friends, go to the gym, watch movies, or do anything else. But my deepest joy, my life plan, if we use philosophical language, is to pursue the pleasures of sex." Is there anything we can say to prove X wrong, especially if X has talent in a field considered more important? Perhaps we could argue that pursuing sex is not as valuable as reading Russian literature. But even here, our argument is not certain.
One could argue that X does not utilize their intellectual capacity. However, this underestimates the reliance on intellect in sexual activities, or suggests that such use is unimportant. Alternatively, one might argue that X does not employ their intellectual abilities in a profound or theoretical manner, but this would exclude many good lives. It can be argued that there are things more important in life than pursuing sexual pleasure.
However, X does not need to live without friends, family, and other significant aspects of a normal life. Some may contend that sexuality objectifies people, making it a mistake to consider it the center of life. But unless that person is an extreme Kantian, objectification in sexuality can be offset by other factors. It can be argued that sexual pleasure will not be the focus of a reasonable life plan, and that these pleasures are not continuous and brief. Their value ultimately depends entirely on the relationships between people that they fit into and create the context for. Goldman. But it is unclear why the brevity and discontinuity of these pleasures are problematic. It can be argued that a person who prefers masturbation over sexual relations with others may reflect a failure to understand the importance and value of sexuality and sexual pleasure, because the significance of sexuality lies in its expression within relationships with others. Scanlon does not seem to refer to casual or promiscuous sex.
But X can have affectionate sexual relationships with others, and friendships, etc., with different people. Even casual encounters have their bonding aspect. Ultimately, it can be argued that sex reaches a level of passion that is unmatched in other forms of interaction, especially when it occurs between lovers. It defines a perfect moment between two people, where each person achieves a deeply affirming and satisfying moment, inherently and inseparably linked to the effort to please the other. Thomas. But be aware that affirmation and satisfaction here can also easily apply to passionate sex without love. Therefore, even if the pursuit of sexual pleasure does not stimulate the intellect like reading classical Arabic poetry, it is not worthless, whether intellectually or non-intellectually, and it is on par with many other activities that humans pursue, activities that lack intellectual depth. Furthermore, isn't providing sexual pleasure an important and valuable trait, a quality that should be cherished? Perhaps we should develop a theory of human dignity based on our sexual capabilities, instead of seeking something noble or superior to sexuality. Sobel. If X lives an ethical life, and if X develops some talents or hobbies for difficult days, which will surely come when X is no longer sexually attractive and X's friends are busy with other things, then X's life is no less valuable than most people's lives. To assert the opposite is arrogant and self-righteous philosophically.
Part 3. Sexual Morality. Part 3. Natural Law Theory. Based on the comparison between human sexuality and the sexuality of lower animals, especially mammals, Aquinas concludes that the natural aspect of human sexuality is the instinct for heterosexual intercourse. Heterosexual intercourse is a mechanism designed by the Christian God to ensure the survival of animal species, including humans, and therefore engaging in this activity is the natural expression of human sexual nature. Furthermore, God designed each part of the human body to perform specific functions, and, according to Aquinas, God created the male penis to deposit sperm into the female vagina for the purpose of reproduction. Therefore, according to Aquinas, placing sperm outside the female vagina is unnatural. It violates God's design and goes against the nature of things established by God. For this reason alone, from Aquinas' perspective, such activities are immoral, a serious sin against the wise plan of the Almighty.
Sexual relations with lower animals, bestiality, sexual activity with members of the same sex, homosexuality, and masturbation, according to Aquinas, are unnatural and immoral sexual behaviors for this reason. If they are performed intentionally, according to a person's will, they deliberately disrupt the natural order of the world created by God, which God has commanded to be respected. All of these activities lack the potential for reproduction, and the genital organs and other organs are used or abused for purposes different from the ones for which they were created. Although Aquinas does not explicitly state this, but only hints in this direction, from his philosophy of sexuality, it can be seen that oral sex, even when performed by heterosexuals, is also deviant and morally wrong. In at least cases where orgasm is achieved through this behavior, sperm are not deposited in the correct location and therefore cannot fertilize. If penile penetration of the vagina is considered the typical natural behavior, then any other combination of anatomical connections would be unnatural and thus immoral. For example, the penis, mouth, or fingers penetrating the anus. It should be noted that Aquinas' criterion of naturalness, that sexual behavior must be reproductive and therefore include the insertion of the penis into the vagina, does not refer to human psychology. Aquinas' line of thought provides an anatomical criterion for natural and deviant sexuality, focusing only on the organs within the body and what they can physiologically do, as well as their positions relative to each other.
2. Liberal ethics and consent. Consent is a sufficient condition for a sexual act to be considered ethical. Regardless of whether a person's view is conservative, liberal, or progressive regarding the legality of sexual behaviors, consent remains very important. Most philosophers believe that informed and voluntary consent is necessary and sufficient for sexuality to be morally legitimate. Archard, Maps, Miller, and Wertheimer, Primoratz, and Wertheimer, although some oppose this and argue about the completeness of consent. Consent is crucial because it transforms a wrongful act into a permissible one, though not necessarily a good one. In heterosexual relationships, men and women may have significant differences regarding sexuality, and sexual assault is generally considered very harmful, Wertheimer. Especially important for philosophers. Morally transformative consent means that it changes the moral status of an action from not permitted to permitted. If John takes a book from Lisa's library, the action could be considered theft or borrowing or gifting, depending on whether Lisa agrees or not. A question here is whether consent to sexual contact is morally special or different from other types of transactions, including non-sexual physical contact, according to Chadha. For example, is agreeing to sexual penetration more important than, say, a shoulder massage or even a colonoscopy? Explanations of the importance of sexual consent based on our special relationship with our bodies, as opposed to our relationship with external objects like books, Gardner and Shute, have not distinguished between consent for sexual physical contact and consent for physical contact unrelated to sex. Perhaps explanations based on Wertheimer's evolutionary theory are needed.
The argument that the valid or sincere consent of all parties involved in sexual activity is necessary and sufficient for that sexual activity to be considered morally legitimate can be presented as follows. X's sexual behavior with Y is considered morally legitimate if and only if Y validly consents to that sexual activity. An important question is what it means for Y to validly agree. It seems that Y must do something, perform some action, to be considered as giving consent. According to a purely mental perspective, that action could be entirely mental, such as a thought like, I agree with this action. However, more than just thinking, deciding, or believing may be necessary to interpret what is wrong when X continues to have sex with Y, even though Y, who has agreed, does not clearly communicate their consent to X. Therefore, we have a communication perspective, according to which X wrongs Y if there is no clear communication to continue the sexual activity. Chadha, Doherty. An important issue here is what is necessary for Y to clearly communicate their consent to X. For example, is enthusiasm necessary or sufficient to convey a person's consent? Pinot, Doherty. Another important issue is what Y is agreeing to when consenting to engage in sexual activity. For that consent to be valid, the activity performed must be the activity that was agreed upon, not any other activity.
This seemingly obvious point raises a complex question about what constitutes a sexual act and how many acts of consent are needed to form a complex or ongoing sexual act, which includes multiple parts: kissing, then oral sex, then penetrative sex, etc.
There are additional factors that constitute valid consent. The two most important factors are the absence of coercion and the absence of deception. Coercion undermines the voluntary aspect of consent, and deception undermines the aspect of being fully informed, Doherty and Maps. Other factors include having a clear mind and emotional and cognitive maturity to give consent. Chada. Ultimately, we can imagine cases where there is no coercion or deception, but the person is too young or too intoxicated to give consent. If being fully informed simply means receiving or obtaining the necessary information, we may need to consider additional criteria such as maturity and mental clarity. If it means something more powerful, such as processing information correctly, then perhaps maturity and a clear mind are unnecessary. A final element of valid consensus could be the absence of exploitation, especially in unequal relations, because the stronger party can take advantage of the weaker one without coercion or deception. Archard and Maps. Is valid consent sufficient for a sexual act to be considered morally lawful? The limits of permissible sexuality in the context of love, mutual respect, or marriage consider consent necessary but not sufficient. Moreover, if sexual desire is inherently objectifying, as Kant's view suggests, then the consent of the parties is not enough because consent to sex is consent to an immoral act.
Another reason to reject the completeness of consent is harm. Ignoring harm to third parties. If sexual activity results in harm to one or more participants, then consent may not be sufficient. This view is especially reasonable when it comes to women, as many women engaged in consensual sexual activity are motivated by non-sexual desires, such as not wanting to upset their partner. From one perspective, harm is about psychological effects, particularly regarding their autonomy. West. This implies that prostitutes are harmed because they consented to unwanted sexual activity, which is an unreasonable implication. However, even if the specific expressions of this view are unreasonable, such as West's, this does not negate the reasonable claim that if sexual activity causes harm to one or more consenting parties, then that activity is wrong. One might argue that this reasoning is paternalistic, claiming that people should not engage in sexual activity when such behavior causes harm. Sobel. This objection is valid in that, although harmful sexual activity provides participants with reasons not to engage, it cannot be used to argue that social forces or laws should prohibit this behavior. Wertheimer.
Although there are disagreements about the completeness of consent, the necessity of consent is often considered obvious by philosophers. However, this necessity can be questioned. For example, if we accept the usual view of sexual pleasure, that sexual pleasure is morally similar to any other pleasure, according to Bedtime, then consent may not be necessary. Because if sexual pleasure is insignificant, a person's consent might be disregarded in cases where, although it sounds strange, forcing someone or engaging in sexual activity without their consent is important or necessary, especially for those who are coerced. This could happen with individuals with limited capacity, or even with minors if an ambitious parent thinks that allowing their child to experience some sexual activities, not necessarily intercourse, with others is a good idea. However, we do not need to accept a single perspective that sexual pleasure is random or unimportant. Instead, we can argue that, depending on who the pleasure occurs between, it can be either random or not. Moreover, if, as seems to be the case, people's considered beliefs about sex are that sex is meaningful, imagine declaring that incest or sex with animals is cool because sex is random, then the random view of sex is very likely to be wrong, and in that case, the consensus around the necessity of consent remains unchanged. Why is sex important?
Sex is important because it relates to a person's most private space, their body. Suppose X is an extrovert who is always cheerful when visitors come to their house. One day, X discovers that some people have entered their apartment and used it for entertainment. X feels legitimately violated, indicating that invading private space is a serious misconduct. If this is true for an apartment, it is also true for a person's body, especially since sexual assault often involves inserting something into the body. This explains why sexual assault is experienced as a profound trauma, according to Wertheimer. Sex is important because it relates to a person's private space and their most personal aspect. Note that even if or when sex is important, it does not mean it is only experienced within the context of love or mutual respect. It can be experienced casually as long as there is consent. John Gardner argues that consent may not be necessary for sex because we usually require consent for actions performed on others, while sex, at least in principle, involves mutuality that makes it a shared activity. Chadha responds that joint actions are composed of sub-actions, and consent is necessary for each of those sub-actions. Gardner might reply that sexual sub-actions are also joint actions, so consent for them is not required. Furthermore, even if some actions are not joint actions, the fact that some actions are joint actions is enough to demonstrate that consent is not always necessary for sex. However, it is still unclear why joint actions make consent unnecessary. My participation in synchronized swimming or duet singing still requires my consent.
Individuals with severe cognitive impairments pose complex issues related to sexual consent. Suppose they desire to have sex but cannot consent on their own, or cannot express it clearly. We are faced with two options: either refuse to engage in sexual activity with them, or reconsider the concept of consent in their case, perhaps based on the idea of prior consent. Bianchi. Andrea Bianchi argues that for people with dementia, we should prioritize their health over consent because their quality of life is the most important. She based her argument on the distinction between agreeing to something and consenting to something, where the latter concept, used in medical practice, describes the active willingness of a person to participate in an action, especially when they may lack the full capacity to understand it. Example, benefits and risks. If Bianchi is correct, then only valid consent, not mere agreement, is necessary for a person with dementia to engage in sexual activity, because consent remains a fundamental form of agreement. One difficulty with this argument is that valid consent can be considered crucial for a person's happiness, even more important than satisfying their desires, so relying on happiness as a priority may only take us so far.
Debate on whether consent is sufficient or if additional factors such as love or marriage are necessary. It is quite interesting to compare the views of Aquinas and Nagel on the phenomenon of objectum sexuality, which refers to the behavior of masturbation often seen in men when they caress women's shoes or underwear. Aquinas and Nagel both believe that such activities are unnatural and deviant, but they disagree on the basis of that judgment. For Aquinas, masturbation involving caressing shoes or underwear is unnatural because sperm is not released in the proper place, and therefore this behavior has no reproductive potential. For Nagel, objectum sexuality masturbation is deviant for a completely different reason. In this activity, there is no possibility for a person to perceive or be aroused by the stimulation of another. From a natural psychological perspective, the stimulation of a person with objectum sexuality is considered a defect. It should be noted in this example another difference between Aquinas and Nagel. Aquinas would judge the sexual activity of idolaters as immoral precisely because it is perverted. It violates the natural pattern established by God, while Nagel would not conclude that it is necessarily morally wrong. After all, idol-worshipping sexual behavior can be completely harmless, even if it reveals something suspicious about the psychology of the idolaters.
The historical and social shift from Thomas Aquinas' moral perspective on sexual perversion to Nagel's amoral psychological view represents a more common trend: the gradual replacement of moral or religious judgments about all kinds of deviant behaviors with medical or psychiatric assessments and interventions.
3. Objectification. Treating others as tools for gratification. Objectification is a long-standing issue in the philosophy of sexuality. It originates from Kant's moral philosophy, and many feminists have used the language of objectification to criticize, for example, pornography. Although Kant was concerned with the nature of sexual desire's objectification, feminists do not target sexuality in general, but only within the context of patriarchy, believing it involves men objectifying women sexually in certain contexts. Indeed, sexual desire may not be necessary for the argument that a woman is sexually objectified under patriarchy. A man does not need to desire a woman to tease her with offensive words. Objectification of sexuality is the act of treating or viewing a person solely as a sexual object. Unrestrained sexual activity, watching pornography, teasing women with words, staring, and other examples are all considered related to sexual objectification. The word only is very important because without it there would be no basis for moral complaints when we frequently treat each other as objects. It is unclear whether objectification can only involve mental perception or if it must include an element of treatment. Staring at someone is an interesting example because it is unclear whether it is treatment or just simple perception. Some philosophers, Langton, Nussbaum, and Papadaki, define sexual objectification broadly enough to include mere perception. Including perception is reasonable because objectification seems to relate only to attitude and perception. For example, staring, perceiving while watching pornography. Therefore, X sexualizes Y if and only if X treats or regards Y solely as a sexual object.
The importance of objectification stems from the view that humans are not merely objects, Lemonchek. If humans, regardless of personal achievements, possess a high moral status due to reason, dignity, autonomy, or similar attributes, then it is wrong to devalue someone to a lower level. However, the actual prevalence of sexual objectification and its severity are separate questions. It seems that we rarely treat our partners as mere objects in any clear and concerning way. We are not only aware of their human dignity, but also pay attention to it. Indeed, among the various ways of objectification, instrumentality, denial of autonomy, immobility, replaceability, vulnerability, ownership, and denial of subjectivity, only instrumentality is common. Other aspects, such as ownership and denial of subjectivity, appear to be quite rare, Halwani. Clear cases of turning the object into a sexual object include rape for sexual motives and verbal harassment.
Kant's perspective suggests that the nature of sexual desire is objectification, which prevents sexual partners from satisfying the absolute commandment. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. According to this view, the act of X objectifying oneself, often through masturbation or allowing oneself to be objectified by Y, is also a problematic issue. Kant values duty towards oneself, and his explanation of objectification clearly includes duty towards oneself. When a person engages in sexual activity solely for pleasure, that person abandons their humanity, throws it away, because they only use themselves as a means to satisfy a primal instinct. The prohibition against allowing oneself to be objectified, along with focusing on the nature of sexual desire, is what makes Kant's perspective different from other views on objectification, especially feminist perspectives.
The essence of sexual desire is objectification, because when X desires Y sexually, X desires Y's body and body parts, especially the genitalia, making it difficult, if not impossible, to see Y's humanity as an end. Only sexual desire among our inclinations is directed toward the person as a body, not their work and services. Although morally mutual use for various purposes is permitted as long as it relates to their work and services, sexual interaction is different. In most interactions, we are concerned with a certain ability, talent, or service that the other person can perform, a facet closely tied to their reason. In these cases, either X does not desire Y's body, but rather Y's abilities, talents, or services, or X desires it as a means for Y to demonstrate their abilities. Only when there is sexual desire does X desire Y as a body, as an object. X wants to enjoy Y's body, not their voice, massage skills, or computer skills. And if X desires these aspects in the context of desire and sexual activity, then X wants them to make Y more sexually attractive. Sexual desire dehumanizes a person by reversing our normal relationship with their body. Their body becomes an object, not a tool of our attention. Kant believed that only marriage could make being turned into an object acceptable, although his argument is unconvincing.
Therefore, consent is not sufficient to constitute lawful sexual behavior because consent to sex implies consent to objectification, to something wrong. Kant's perspective also explains why it is reasonable to emphasize the importance of defining sexual objectification. Although X and Y treat each other well during sex, they still regard each other as mere sexual objects. The phenomenology of sexual desire seems to confirm Kant's view. The bodies of others, their lips, thighs, buttocks, and toes, are desired as inherently stimulating parts, different from the person. In a good sexual encounter, even with a lover, at some point they focus on the buttocks, penis, vagina, breasts, etc. Kant's perspective that desire and sexual activity are distinct, even potentially unique compared to other ways we perceive and interact with others, appears to be correct, providing a basis for the conclusion that sexual desire is objectifying. Sexual desire also seems to be very strong. Its attraction is immense. Its voice echoes loudly, persistently, and irresistibly, to the point that people do irrational and immoral things to satisfy it. This may be a gender characteristic of sexual desire, more so in men than in women, although throughout history, and especially in today's popular culture, women are often portrayed as never being sexually satisfied. Of course, sexual partners usually adhere to boundaries in how they treat each other. They do not violate each other, do not treat each other as objects, etc., because they understand that they should not treat others in such ways. Therefore, sexual desire operates within an ethical framework.
The issue of objectification, according to Kant's perspective, is not easy to resolve. The argument that there is no such thing as objectification, because humans do not have any special moral status from which they can be demeaned, does not align with Kant's own stance, as Sobel emphasizes. The claim that participants in sexual behavior usually agree to it, Mappes, that objectification is acceptable as long as there is mutual respect in the relationship, Nussbaum, or that sexual partners meet each other's sexual needs, Goldman, Singer, also do not solve the problem because none of these approaches address the nature of sexual desire. Another option is to accept the issue as a problem or argue that human sexual desire is not always objectified. This is not merely an idea emphasized by a subjective perspective that human sexual desire is very complex, because Kant's view on sexuality can encompass this point, but also that sexuality is not simply the desire to use another person's body in a degrading way to satisfy one's selfish lust. Even the most intimate aspects of this and sexual desire are combined, at least in healthy individuals, with other emotional factors, completely changing their meaning.
However, Kant's perspective can also encompass this understanding. For example, X may desire Y sexually because Y, among other qualities, is a kind person, to the extent that X would not desire Y otherwise. But once X desires Y, X also desires Y's body and physical parts. Sexual desire can be selfish while still being intertwined with other elements of human emotion, and Kant's view does not necessarily have to be limited to a simple perspective of sexual desire as crude selfishness or always carried out in a way that degrades dignity.
From Kant's point of view, sexuality can focus on the needs of others. However, the above idea suggests that sexual desire can be combined with healthy emotions, making it not always harmful, although the specific mechanism remains unclear. To succeed, sexual desire needs to be integrated with healthy emotions rather than simply added, so that its nature changes in specific situations. According to Kant's perspective, not all sexual activities are objectifying. Sexual activity that does not stem from sexual desire may not be objectifying. Even in cases where sexual activity is objectifying, the severity varies. In voluntary encounters, it competes with other moral factors, while in cases of rape with a sexual motive, it is very serious, because sexual desire is the primary motive. The motive is not the objectification of a person, as this rarely occurs. Instead, X perceives Y in a way that involves sexual objectification.
Furthermore, sexual objectification may differ between men and women, especially if men and women experience sexuality differently. Men tend to experience sexual desire more frequently and intensely than women, although both generally enjoy similar levels of pleasure from sexual activity. Therefore, men are more likely to engage in sexual objectification than women because men think about sex more often, look at others more frequently, and are more easily visually stimulated. Since both genders objectify each other almost equally during sexual activity, men generally objectify women more than women objectify men. Men also consume more pornography, heterosexual and homosexual, than women, so they participate in sexual objectification more by watching people on screen, viewing others as mere sexual objects, etc. Perhaps in this sense, pornography allows women and men as objects of desire for other men to be objectified.
Some feminists argue that pornography dehumanizes women by objectifying them and portraying them as mere sexual tools for men, Hill, by depicting their pleasure as solely for men, Longino, by endorsing this treatment, or by conveying the message that all women are like those depicted in pornography, Gary. However, these arguments do not seem convincing. Pornography shows that both men and women enjoy sex with each other, and it is difficult to prove that women's pleasure is only depicted for men. One could also argue the opposite, because those scenes do not tell us anything specific, Sobel. Pornography also does not seem to convey any message about women's status, whether regarding the women portrayed or women in general. Such portrayals diminish the viewer's ability to imagine scenes as they wish, thereby weakening the very purpose of sexual arousal. However, pornography facilitates the objectification of women by displaying them before the gaze of male viewers. Similarly for men in pornography, although the gaze is that of gay men. This form of objectification appears harmless, as long as it does not harm women, whether individually or as a group. A deeper form of objectification is found in the view that pornography constructs women's sexuality in a negative way. It sexualizes patriarchal perceptions of women, making sexual desire linked to dominance. The sexual desires of young men who frequently watch pornography become desires for the sexual domination of women. Women become sexual entities constructed by society for men, to the extent that men desire them as pornography depicts, like unreal entities. Objectification defines femininity, and unilateralism defines mutuality. However, this perspective irrationally overlooks the biological aspect of sexual desire, claiming that sexual desire can be entirely socially constructed. Furthermore, since this is an empirical view, no convincing evidence has been presented to support it. As we have seen, sexual desire is enough to lead to objectification. However, it is not a necessary condition. For example, a man teasing a woman to feel like he is part of a group, as well as directors and editors of porn films by choosing camera angles and editing cuts, contribute to the sexual objectification of actors by presenting them to viewers in specific ways. A similar reasoning applies to, for instance, brothel owners. Indeed, women themselves may have very few options other than to self-objectify sexually in a society that primarily values women through their sexuality. This may be the most dangerous form of sexual objectification, as social forces guide or pressure, not necessarily force, women to accept such identities or self-presentations in order to have a better life, although whether they truly develop or not is more difficult to assess.
Recently, the concept of derivation has been used to study sexuality and sexual behaviors. Deriving something involves describing, expressing, understanding, or approaching an entity primarily as a reflection, projection, or expression of the identity, desires, fears, etc. of another entity. The derived subject can be simplified in any way related to the existence of the deriving subject, kahil. This perspective can capture some core issues of feminism regarding pornography, specifically the portrayal of female sexuality as a reflection of men's sexual desire for women. However, derivation does not seem to encompass all cases or does not adequately cover all cases. Consider a discreet gay man who teases a woman just to impress his friends. He treats the woman as an object, but does not seem to derive from her. If the answer is that he teases her because she does not represent his desire, but for example, societal expectations of how women should be, then since in any sexual situation one can attribute derivation to either party, derivation risks becoming empty or too broad to be meaningful.
Part 4. Issues of Sexual Perversion. 1. Analysis by Thomas Nagel. The definition of perversion is based on the lack of psychological interaction, reciprocal feedback regarding arousal. Thomas Nagel rejects the central premise of Aquinas that to discover what is natural in human sexuality, we should emphasize the similarities between humans and lower animals. Applying this formula, Aquinas concludes that the purpose of sexual activity and reproductive organs in humans is reproduction, as it is in lower animals. Everything else in Aquinas' philosophy of sexuality is logically inferred from this. Conversely, Nagel argues that to discover what is special about human natural sexuality, and therefore to infer what is unnatural or deviant, we should focus on the differences between humans and lower animals. We should emphasize the ways in which humans differ from animals, the ways in which humans and their sexuality are unique. Therefore, Nagel contends that sexual deviance in humans should be understood as a psychological phenomenon, rather than, as in Aquinas' approach, in terms of anatomy and physiology. Because it is human psychology that makes us different from other species, a theory of human natural sexuality must acknowledge the uniqueness of human psychology. Nagel argues that sexual interactions in which each person responds with sexual arousal upon perceiving the other's arousal reflect the natural psychology of human sexuality. In such encounters, each individual perceives themselves and the other as both the subject and the object of a shared sexual experience. Deviant encounters, or events, are those in which this mutual recognition of arousal does not exist, and in which one person remains entirely the subject of the sexual experience or entirely the object. Deviance, therefore, is distortion or truncation of a model of arousal and a psychologically complete consciousness. There is nothing in Nagel's psychological analysis of the natural and the deviant that refers to organs in the body or physiological processes. That is, for a sexual encounter to be natural, it does not need to have a reproductive form, as long as there is the necessary psychological presence of mutual awareness. According to Nagel, whether a sexual activity is natural or deviant does not depend on which parts are used or where they are placed, but solely on the psychological nature of that sexual encounter. Therefore, Nagel does not agree with Aquinas that homosexual activities as a specific type of sexual behavior are unnatural or deviant, because oral sex and anal sex between gay individuals can entirely be accompanied by mutual recognition and response to sexual arousal. 2. Fetishism and deviant behaviors.
It is quite interesting to compare Aquinas and Nagel's views on fetishism, that is, the common behavior among men of masturbating while stroking a woman's shoe or underwear. Both Aquinas and Nagel believe that such activities are unnatural and deviant, but they disagree on the basis of this judgment. For Aquinas, masturbation involving stroking shoes or underwear is unnatural because sperm are not released in the proper place, and therefore this behavior has no reproductive potential. For Nagel, fetishist masturbation is deviant for a completely different reason. In this activity, there is no possibility for a person to proceed or be aroused by the stimulation of another person. From a natural psychological perspective of humans, the stimulation of a person with object fetishism is considered a defect. It should be noted that in this example, there is another difference between Aquinas and Nagel. Aquinas would judge the sexual activity of a fetishist as immoral, precisely because it is perverted. It violates the natural pattern established by God, while Nagel would not necessarily conclude that it is morally wrong. After all, a fetishistic sexual act can be completely harmless, even if it reveals something suspicious about the fetishist's psychology. The historical and social shift from Thomas Aquinas' moral view of sexual perversion to Nagel's amoral psychological perspective represents a more common trend: the gradual replacements of moral or religious judgments about all kinds of deviant behaviors with medical or psychiatric assessments and interventions.
The most famous contemporary philosophical view is based on Thomas Nagel's psychological perspective on sexual deviance. Natural sexual desire involves mutual awareness at multiple levels between two people. X perceives a sexual arousal in Y perceives arousal in X perceives that Y is stimulated by X, and so on. Sexual desire is complex because it includes X's sexual arousal caused by Y and X's feeling of desire due to Y's stimulation by X, and this continues at higher levels. Sexual deviation then refers to fixed preferences for sexual activities unrelated to the multi-level sexual arousal stages. Since this perspective defines normalcy and deviation based on the preferences of the individual engaging in the behavior, the sexual act itself does not necessarily reflect this structure. Only desire requires this complexity. Therefore, accusing it of being a genderless perversion, Solomon, or evaluating it by providing examples of uncomplicated sexual behaviors is inaccurate. Kupfer.
Although this view may accept some sexual deviations such as zoophilia, pedophilia, and sexual relations with inanimate objects, because they seem to be stuck in some primitive version of the first stage of sexual emotion, according to Nagel, it leads to counterintuitive results. Masturbation is not highly valued from this perspective, depending on whether it emphasizes the perception of the actual embodiment, not imagination, of desire in others or not, according to Sobel. It also misinterprets how sexual deviations typically operate. Fetishists usually do not desire sexual relations with feces, but rather incorporate feces into their sexual behavior with others, which can involve multiple levels of awareness. Furthermore, this explanation does not capture the common intuitions about natural and deviant sexuality. It goes beyond the reasonable idea that the arousal of one partner increases the arousal of the other to the point of multi-layered arousal, an unintuitive concept. Similar views are based on the idea that natural sexual desire is interactive between individuals, such as it reaching a climax in love, Scruton 1986, and conveying attitudes and emotions, Solomon. A non-psychological explanation of sexual deviance, closer to folk biology, suggests that only reproduction allows us to distinguish deviance from non-deviance, Ruddick, C.F. Gray. This does not mean that all behaviors must lead to reproduction, but rather that natural sexual desires can lead to reproduction under normal physiological conditions. Therefore, a heterosexual couple engaging in sexual activity without the intention of having children is not participating in deviant sexual behavior. Their desires are of a type that, under normal physiological conditions, can lead to reproduction.
However, this argument can lead to unreasonable implications. Anyone who prefers oral sex, heterosexual, over intercourse is considered deviant. Moreover, any heterosexual couple using fetish objects, urine, feces, etc. in their sexual activity is regarded as naturally sexual, according to Gray and Primaratz. Indeed, coprophilia can refute all the above arguments. Two people exhibiting an interactive attitude between individuals in the form of multi-level perception, engaging in reproductive-type sexual activity and genuinely conveying healthy emotions, but using feces in their activities are, contrary to intuition, not considered deviant by any of the above arguments. Although explaining biological deviance seems obvious, deviance is not only opposed to natural, but also to normal, and natural and normal do not completely overlap. Moreover, the concept of deviance can refer to many things: immorality, disgust, oddity, and biological abnormality, among others. Using only one of these to define deviance might fail. It is also possible that the approach to discussing this concept is flawed, not considering the social function of the concept. Miller. Therefore, some philosophers have proposed completely eliminating this concept. Priest and Primaratz. Roos. However, recently, a new interpretation of deviance based on its suppression of common joy, mutual discovery, self-assertion, and connection has been proposed. Kupfer. But this view seems to set the bar too high for what is considered non-deviant.
A good theory of sexual deviation may need to be normative, capturing the core of the deviation, but not necessarily encompassing all our beliefs about it. It should explain why our beliefs are mistaken when they are. Furthermore, it could be a psychological theory, a sexual preference involving or related to certain types of anti-life objects, such as bodily waste and corpses, and biologically unusual objects, such as interspecies mating. Evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology will have to play an important role.
Part 5. The value and meaning of sexuality. 1. Non-moral evaluation. Assessment based on pleasure, health, and safety, risks of disease, and psychological harm. Non-moral evaluation. We can also evaluate sexual activity, again either a specific sexual act or a particular type of sexual activity, from a non-moral perspective. Good sex, from a non-moral standpoint, is sexual activity that brings pleasure to the participants or provides physical or emotional satisfaction, while bad sex, from a non-moral perspective, is uninteresting, dull, boring, uncomfortable, or even unpleasant. A similar example will clarify the difference between judging something as good or bad from a moral perspective and judging it as good or bad from a non-moral perspective. The radio on my table is a good radio in an unethical sense because it meets my expectations of a radio. It always produces clear sound. If, instead, the radio emits static and crackling most of the time, then it would be a bad radio from an unethical perspective, and it would be unreasonable to blame the radio for its faults and threaten it with a trip to hell if it does not improve its behavior. Similarly, sexual activity may not be morally good if it provides us with what we expect from it, usually sexual pleasure, and this does not necessarily have any moral significance.
It is not difficult to see that a sexual activity that is completely morally bad, by satisfying both parties abundantly, does not inherently mean that the behavior is morally good. Some extramarital sexual activities can be very enjoyable for those involved, but are morally wrong. Moreover, a sexual activity that is not morally good, meaning it does not bring pleasure to the participants, does not inherently mean that the behavior is morally bad. Unpleasant sexual activities can occur between inexperienced individuals who do not yet know how to do things properly or are unsure of what they like or dislike, but their failure to bring pleasure to each other does not inherently mean they are engaging in morally wrong behaviors.
Therefore, moral evaluation of sexual activity is a separate issue from the immoral assessment of sexual activity, even though there are still important connections between them. For example, if a sexual act brings pleasure to both participants and is therefore considered immoral, it can be seen as a strong but superficial reason to consider the act morally good, or at least to have some moral value. Indeed, utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and even John Stuart Mill might argue that overall, the immoral nature of sexual activity greatly contributes to justifying it. Another example, if a person never tries to bring sexual pleasure to their partner, but selfishly only wants to experience their own pleasure, then that person's contribution to their sexual activity is morally questionable or objectionable. But that judgment is not solely based on the fact that the person does not bring pleasure to the other, that is, on the fact that the sexual activity is amoral for the other person. Moral judgment, more precisely, is based on that person's motives when they do not want to bring any joy, when they do not want to make that experience morally wrong for others.
Pointing out that from an evaluative perspective, the moral goodness or badness of an action is entirely different from its amoral goodness or badness is one thing. However, questioning the emotional or psychological connection between the moral qualities of sexual activity and its amoral qualities is another matter. Perhaps morally good sexual activity also tends to be the most satisfying sexual activity in an amoral sense. Whether this is true or not likely depends on how we understand what morally good sex means and on certain aspects of human moral psychology. What would our lives be like if there were always a clear correspondence between the moral quality of a sexual act and its amoral quality? I am not sure what the human sexual world would look like in such a case, but examples that clearly violate such correspondence are easily found in this world today. A sexual act can be both morally good and amoral. Consider the pleasurable and enjoyable sexual activity of a newlywed couple.
However, a sexual act can also be both morally good and morally bad. Consider the everyday sexual behaviors of this couple after they have been married for 10 years. A sexual act can be both morally bad and morally good. One person in the married couple has been unfaithful for 10 years with someone who is already married and finds their sexual activity extremely satisfying. And finally, a sexual act can be both morally bad and immoral. The cheating couple is bored with each other and ultimately no longer feels the same excitement as before. A world in which there is little or no difference between the moral and immoral qualities of sexual activity may be a better world than ours, or it may be worse. I will not make such judgments unless I am quite certain about the inherently good and bad moral nature of sexual activity from the outset, and until I understand more about human psychology. Sometimes, the fact that a sexual activity is recognized as morally wrong in itself can contribute to making it good in an immoral sense. The dangers of sexual activity. Whether a specific sexual behavior or type of sexual activity provides sexual pleasure is not the only factor in assessing its morality. Practical considerations and caution also play an important role in determining whether a sexual act, in all aspects, is somewhat immoral. Many sexual activities can carry risks, dangers, or cause physical or psychological harm.
For example, anal intercourse, whether performed by a heterosexual couple or two gay men, can damage sensitive tissues and is a potential transmission mechanism for many types of HIV viruses, as well as other heterosexual sexual activities. Therefore, when evaluating whether a sexual behavior is morally good or bad, it is not only necessary to consider pleasure or expected satisfaction, but also to examine all negative side effects, undesirable, whether the sexual behavior has the potential to harm the body, such as in some sadomasochistic acts, or transmit any sexually transmitted diseases, or lead to unintended pregnancy.
or even whether people might feel regret, anger, or guilt afterward for engaging in a sexual act with this person at this location or under these conditions, or of a specific type. Indeed, all these pragmatic and cautious factors are also considered in evaluating the morality of sexual activity. Intentionally causing unwanted pain or discomfort to a partner, or failing to take adequate precautions against pregnancy, or not informing a partner of suspected sexually transmitted infections, but see David Mayo's controversial opinion in The Duty to Warn About HIV, can all be morally wrong. Therefore, depending on the specific ethical principles regarding sexuality that a person accepts, the elements that constitute the immoral nature of sexual behavior may influence that person's moral judgment.
2. Humanistic value. The humanistic value of sexuality lies in its role as a form of expression, connection, and pleasure that can genuinely contribute to a meaningful life. It does not need to be fully justified by reproduction, love, or higher intelligence. Denying this value does not diminish sexuality, but merely reflects the arrogance of imposing a single model of a meaningful life for all people. Sexuality is a unique form of communication in which people express their bodies, emotions, and vulnerability in ways that other forms of interaction cannot replace. Even when not associated with love or reproduction, sexuality can still create mutual acknowledgement, moments where two subjects confirm each other's presence and value. In this regard, sexuality has humanistic value because it expands the ways in which people can connect and understand each other. Sex is often associated with reproduction and therefore considered a valuable tool when reproduction is valued. However, the development of reproductive technology and anti-reproductive stances show that the value of sex cannot be equated with reproductive function. Similarly, sex can lead to, express, or reinforce love, but this only makes the value of sex dependent on love, while these two phenomena are fundamentally different. Therefore, if we view sex solely through the lens of reproduction or love, we will overlook its independent humanistic value.
A central question is whether sexuality has intrinsic value. The most convincing answer is sexual pleasure can be an end in itself, similar to many other forms of pleasure that people pursue in life. The fleeting or intermittent nature of sexual pleasure is not enough to deny its value, because many other human values, art, entertainment, sports, share similar characteristics. Therefore, sexuality does not need to be justified by higher, noble goals to be meaningful. From a philosophical perspective on the meaning of life, a person considering the pursuit of sexual pleasure as a central part of their life plan does not automatically make that life less valuable. Unless we accept an elite standard of intellectual life, most activities that people dedicate their lives to lack significant theoretical depth. Therefore, excluding sexuality from the list of activities with humanistic value reflects more moral prejudice than a solid philosophical argument. An important humanistic point is that sexuality can be regarded as a valuable trait of humanity, rather than something to be hidden or overcome. Instead of viewing sexuality as inferior to reason or spirituality, we can understand it as a component of human nature, the ability to experience pleasure, respond to others through the body, and create meaning through physical experiences. The humanistic value of sexuality does not negate the need for moral boundaries. A sexually fulfilling life with humanistic value is one that does not harm others, does not destroy relationships, and does not undermine other essential capacities for long-term living. When these conditions are met, considering sexuality as an important part of life is not degenerate, but a legitimate life choice. 3. Sex and modern technology.
The discussion about exclusion and inclusion of sexuality has led some philosophers to suggest that sexual needs can be met by sex robots, replacing the need for sexual relations with a partner, especially if technology is advanced enough for sex with robots to provide an experience nearly identical to sex with a human. Dinucci, MacArthur. This raises several philosophical questions. First, if robots are sufficiently sophisticated, they could be considered persons, meaning they also have sexual autonomy, which brings us back to similar issues regarding the rights to sexual relations with a partner. It also raises general questions about how to interact with them ethically. Needholm, Peterson.
On Monday, there are concerns from the feminist perspective about the appearance of these robots. If they are designed to attract the stereotypical gaze of men, then using them may encourage or exacerbate the objectification and dehumanization of women. Lieberman. Another feminist concern, regardless of the robot's appearance, is the ease of engaging in sexual relations with them, and the fact that they cannot truly refuse sex, which could also reinforce gender discriminatory attitudes towards women, especially the view that men have the right to sexual relations at will. Danaher, Earp, and Sandberg, Richardson. Issues related to sex robots are not all about sexuality and technology. Another issue concerns the impact of using dating apps and partner finding applications on our lives, requiring a consideration of their benefits and costs. Although these apps make it easier for people to meet and choose more carefully, some worry that they allow users to be too selective, promote superficiality, and foster racist desires. MacArthur. Neil MacArthur argues that the benefits outweigh the costs, and many of those costs can anyway be mitigated. MacArthur also argued that technology has created a new sexual identity, digital sexuality. Those who identify as digital sexual are people for whom advanced technology is an integral part of their preferred sexual experience, and who may not see the need to have a human partner to achieve a fulfilling sex life. MacArthur believes that these new identities are positive because they allow like-minded individuals to find each other, and such identities can help provide legal and social protection if necessary.
Besides robots and applications, the third issue with sexual technology is tactile sex toys over the internet capable of transmitting tactile sensations remotely, according to Arel. Such technologies have many benefits, but they also pose specific problems, such as third parties infiltrating the system and thus engaging in sexual behavior through deception, or attacking one or more parties involved in the system and impersonating partners to the extent that even if a person is not deceived into thinking they are having sex with, for example, John, the person John claims to be is not actually who they say they are, according to Sparrow and Karas. According to Robbie Arel, virtual reality and augmented reality technology, more generally referred to as extended reality technology, are more likely to become the future compared to robots because they are cheaper, versatile, easier to move and store, and only a short step away from current adult technology. Although these technologies have benefits, they also raise ethical concerns related to deepfake and the possibility that people may gradually prefer to engage in sexual activities through them rather than with real partners. Arel.
Part 6. Conclusion. Looking back on the long journey of philosophy regarding sexuality, we see a great shift in human thought, from viewing sexuality as an instinct to be suppressed to recognizing it as a radiant dimension of personhood. In its earliest definitions, sexuality might have been merely a biological impulse, a tool for reproduction, or fleeting waves of pleasure. But through the lens of modern philosophy, we understand that it encompasses much more. It is a space where individuals exercise their freedom, where consent is not just a dry moral rule, but the highest respect for the dignity of others. When we move beyond debates between pessimism and optimism, between the strict doctrines of natural law and the liberal openness of liberalism, a final human truth emerges.
The true value of sexuality lies in humanization. It is when we no longer see the partner as a tool or object to satisfy, but as a complete subject, a person with a soul, desires, and the voice of their own.
In an era where technology and virtualization are gradually infiltrating every corner of intimacy, preserving the human aspect of sexuality becomes more important than ever. True connection does not lie in mechanical contact, but in psychological feedback, the moment when we realize we are understood and accepted by another person. Closing my philosophical reflections, I realize that sexuality is a delicate bridge connecting animal instincts and the transcendence of the soul. It is a language through which we express our identity, a way to overcome existential loneliness, and the clearest evidence that we are beings who need each other to become complete. Ultimately, beyond physical desires, what humans truly seek is empathy and a secure place in the heart of another person.